Thanks for coming, and thanks to Susan Smaller for suggesting me as a possible speaker. What Susan didn't tell you is that she was one of my better students at the law school in my public health law class, and so I'm really delighted to be here. And thanks to Sarah Sarah Heckler for sort of putting all this together and organizing it, and I really appreciate the turnout you were able to get. It doesn't look like there's an empty seat in the House. There may not be a dry eye in the House after I'm done talking about some of the problems with vaccination and vaccine policy. As I was getting ready for this and finishing my PowerPoint yesterday, a piece came across on Slate that said that within a couple of years, we are
I don't know why it would do.
There's a feature. Oh, you don't mind? Let me turn this on.
Oh.
How's that? Is that better?
We need to interrupt a second.
Yeah.
Can you just announce that they mute their...
That the mute, yes. For those of you listening from space, can you mute whatever electronic devices you have there? Thanks. I appreciate that. Anyways, I'm driving in. There's a story about Benjamin Franklin's sister and how she talks about the birth and death of all 12 of her children. Right? And because I was coming to this presentation, it kind of reminded me of what the world was like before there were antibiotics and before there were childhood vaccinations and before we had a smallpox vaccine that didn't cause the kind of side effects, right? So when we think about resistance to vaccination or conscientious objection, however we're going to characterize this, I think it's important to always keep in mind for yourselves and for your patients, right, the world we came from. Because I think it's easy for especially parents when they're bringing in their children to think, well, why should I put my child in any risk, right, from this vaccine when there's really no population risk? There's only no population risk because of the success of vaccinations. Okay. So what I want to talk about is these 4 things. And by the way, because I come from a legal teaching background, my default mode is kind of interaction. So at the end, there will certainly be time for questions and answers. But if you have questions or if I'm not being clear, it's quite likely, or if anything else occurs to you during the presentation, please feel free to raise it, and I'll be happy to engage in a conversation. I want to talk just very briefly about the history and legal basis of anti-immunization exemptions. I want to talk a little bit about state law and vaccination with special attention to Delaware for obvious reasons. And then I want to talk both about creative ideas for decreasing the incidence of people opting out of vaccinations, and then about compensation for vaccine-related injuries, which you might not know too much about. So, I think there's a tendency to believe, and I think I might have shared this belief before I did some reading, that the idea of people resisting vaccination is something new and something that's sort of occasioned by the success, right, sort of paradoxically by the success of the vaccination movement. But that's not true, right? So as we know, right, Edward Jenner develops the idea of a vaccine for smallpox when he sees that milkmaids aren't contracting smallpox, right? Because they have a lot of contact with cows, right? And he figures out through kind of observation that they've been immunized effectively by the antibodies from the cows. So he comes up with this idea for a vaccine. And I read this book called Pox. Does anybody know the book called Pox by Michael Roerich, who is a professor at Harvard? He does sort of science and history. And it's really a fascinating read, right? Because he talks about the resistance, right, in the 19th and even early part of the 20th century, the vaccination. And if you read the book, people had some good reasons for being resistant. And I was, as I'm reading it and assigning chapters of it or pieces of it to my public health law class, I'm trying to get them to see the connections between the reasons people might have had resistance then and the reasons for resistance now. So medicine was basically completely unregulated. So we had these vaccinations, right? But sometimes the points that were used, or sometimes the serum itself was tainted. Sometimes people would get tetanus from this, right? Because of the unsterilized equipment. There were all kinds of problems, and not only that.
Room 9, take it, yes. Attention please.
Oh, not only that, voice of God or something. Not only that, but the enforcement tended to be exactly against the populations you would expect, right? So, you know, authorities would go in, public health and the police would work together, and they would go into immigrant communities where there were, you know, very poor living conditions and forcibly vaccinate people. Right? So it's no wonder that you had resistance to vaccination, right? And if you think about the kinds of reasons people would oppose vaccination, it's not surprising that this is still the case. I want to talk very quickly now about the Jacobson case. So those of you that have a legal background will know about this case. Those of you that don't won't, right? But it's an important case. 1905, the Supreme Court of the U.S. decrees that the government can vaccinate people against their will. Or what they more precisely hold is that they can fine you, criminal fine, if you refuse to be vaccinated. Okay? So what happens in this case, there's a smallpox outbreak in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Jacobson, his name is Henning Jacobson, for religious reasons, right? A religious Swedish immigrant decides that he does not want to be vaccinated. And he'd rather, and he also doesn't think he should have to pay the fine. So the case ends up in the U.S. Supreme Court. It goes all the way up to the Massachusetts courts, and then he takes his case to the U.S. Supreme Court. Well, you can't just take a case to the Supreme Court because you want to. The Supreme Court needs to have jurisdiction over the case. And the jurisdiction, he was arguing, was that forcing him to this coercive choice of whether to be vaccinated or pay a fine is an invasion of his liberty interest, which is protected by the Constitution, right? So the Constitution says in the due process clause that everyone has a right to liberty, right? It's a little bit less clear than that, but there's this idea of substantive due process, which is not that you're entitled to the right procedures, but that we have this inherent autonomy and this personal liberty that the state can invade, at least not without a compelling reason. And the court says, but this is kind of a compelling reason, right? And here I have a quote from the court in which they say, the liberty secured by the Constitution does not import an absolute right in each person to be wholly free from restraint. They talk about the common good, and they say, you know, in a case like this, the only way to secure real liberty is by everybody making certain sacrifices, right? Otherwise, the liberty you're talking about is kind of illusory if you have a population where people are dying and getting infected and everyone's a law unto themselves. And the court understood, even back in 1905, the idea that by refusing to get vaccinated, right, you're exposing other people to risk. And smallpox, as we know, was no joke, right? I mean, it's one of the more deadly illness. So there's Mr. Jacobson, right? So I want to draw an important distinction here. Okay, I think this is something that is easy to get. So the government of a particular state, this is really a state-by-state thing, right, can require everyone to get vaccinated, right? They can do that. And why is that? Because states have the police power, and the police power basically says that the state, at the state level, they can regulate whatever's necessary for the health, the safety, and the welfare of the population, right? So the states have this, what we call plenary authority, right? The federal government only has enumerated powers, right? Now, could they order vaccination on some theory that contagious diseases really affect interstate commerce? You could construct some kind of argument along those lines, right? But really, the primary source of power for vaccination comes from the state level. And that's why you have all these different state laws about who has to be vaccinated, what kinds of exemptions are recognized, right? And it varies from state to state, which to people that aren't immersed in the U.S. system seems a little crazy, right? That we don't just do things on the federal level, but that's the nature of our Constitution, and that's just the way it is. So the state can require vaccination, but that's not the same as saying that they have to require vaccination. And each state can sort of set up its own rules. Okay, so here's a cartoon, and I think, you know, you probably can't read this, but here's a kid with the measles, and the doctor is saying to the parents, if you connect the measles, it spells out my parents are idiots, all right? Now, I put that up there to be provocative, okay, because my guess is that people who are treating families where there's this immunization resistance might actually be thinking this. All right, but it's not necessarily helpful to sort of getting where you want to go. Okay, so there is this thought, oh, please, we've had measles outbreaks, right? This disease should be eradicated or close to it, and instead we're dealing with these bubblings up, I guess is the plural, of measles. So the state doesn't have to do it. And we have, in almost all states, with a couple of exceptions that I'll discuss presently, we have exemptions along certain lines. So the obvious exemption is kids or adults, if it's a vaccination that would be required for adults, right? Where there's a medical contraindication. Nobody thinks that's controversial. What's controversial there is how that gets decided, who gets to decide, what kind of appeal there is, those kinds of questions. But the idea of a medical exemption is certainly nothing controversial, at least in substance, right? But we also have, in almost all states, religious exemptions. And in about a third of the states, we also have philosophical exemptions. Okay? So a religious exemption is basically, well, I'll get into this in more detail in a minute, but according to my religious beliefs, vaccination is not permissible, I'll just put it that way, and therefore I shouldn't have to get vaccinated. Now you might say, isn't this in defiance of what the court said in Jacobson, right? But all Jacobson says is the state can require you to do this, not that they must. And if we have enough herd immunity, we might think it's okay to let people have a religious exemption, right? Because we value religious liberty. But there comes a point, as we've seen in recent outbreaks of things like measles and pertussis and mumps, that when you have a cluster of people that are unvaccinated, there are risks imposed on others who are either immunocompromised and can't get vaccinated, or too young to be vaccinated, or for whom the vaccinations have less than complete efficacy. So those are some of the issues that explain some of the population. You're without a seat. There's a seat over there.
I sit all day.
Okay. All right. I just didn't want you to feel like you couldn't move over there because I was standing here. So why did all the states sort of almost suddenly pass these exemptions? And this is something you might not be aware of. In 1974, Congress passed the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, and in order to get federal funding, the states were required to put religious exemptions to vaccinations in their state laws. The one thing we know about Congress, even though its direct power is limited, it can boss the states around by coercing them, by saying, we'll give you this money only if. Here's some highway funding, but you get this if you raise your drinking age to 21. It's the classic example, right? So that's what happened in the 1970s. This was later repealed, right? But the laws stayed in place because the state laws themselves weren't repealed, right? That takes a separate action. And as I said, some states, even though they weren't required to do so, added these exemptions for philosophical reasons. So not just religious, but philosophical. So the way this works, because there's no reason not to use a smart art graphic when you've got one, is there are always medical exemptions. Those are the bottom of the pyramid. In most states, religious, and then in about a third of the states, these philosophical exemptions. Let's look at who's covered. Okay, so where this gets, yeah, go ahead.
Are you going to get to what in the world philosophical means?
Yes.
My whole philosophy is probably different than yours.
Yes, but as it will turn out, all right, the way religious exemptions are defined, enforced these days, right, it doesn't so much matter. It used to be, we'll get into this in more detail, that there was really some sort of substantial inquiry into your religiously based exemption. And now in most states, and I'll show you the form in Delaware in a second, so it's a reason to live, right? I'm going to show you this form. You will see that basically all you have to do is say, I have a religious exemption. So as a practical matter, the difference between philosophical and religious has kind of collapsed in most states. I think that's a fair statement. But yeah, I mean, the same objection or the same question that you're raising could also be asked of religious exemptions. Well, what does that even mean unless it comports with a particular doctrine of a given religion? That raises its own issues, which I'll discuss in a minute. I know I keep saying I'm going to discuss all these things in a minute, but I really will. So the way we enforce this is through school entry requirements, right? So you have this course of action, vaccinations that students must have before they enter school. And what's interesting here is that states vary substantially in what schools are covered by that requirement. So in Delaware, as we'll see, it only applies to children going to public school. And that's what the statute says, right? So all state statutes apply in the context of public schools. In many states, right, the requirement applies to both public and private schools. And in a few states, it applies even if you're homeschooling your child. Okay? Now, I find this interesting because I think anecdotally, based on people I speak to at the law school or people that have some means in Delaware, it seems like more than other places I've seen, there's a lot of kids in private school in Delaware, the Wilmington area, right? So this exempts a lot of kids. So if your kid is going to private school, you don't even have to come up with one of these exemptions because you can go to that school. Now the school itself might have a requirement, right? And they can do that because they're a private school. They can enforce that requirement. But as a matter of state law, there's no such requirement that applies to private schools. Okay? So that I think is something to keep in mind as you're talking to patients. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the Delaware law, which I've already kind of done by sort of previewing this. So basically, and this is very typical, right? The law says that the Department of Public Health in Delaware must pass regulations that designate a basic series of immunizations. And they're all the ones that the CDC recommends. It just sort of tracks that. Well, except for HPV, but I'll talk about that sort of separately in a minute, because that really raises some separate issues, right? So these are the vaccines that kids must take at an appropriate age as a condition of entering school for that year. So it might be before school even starts, it might be a little bit later, depending on what the vaccine is. Right? Again, this applies only to public school. We also have the medical exemption, which I have there on the right, a written statement from a physician stating that the enrollee should not receive the prescribed immunization because of the reasonable certainty of a reaction detrimental to that person. Now, my my guess, you can correct me if I'm wrong, since after all it's a guess, right, is that there's not much oversight of this, right? So if a physician simply signs off on something like this, there won't be sort of a hearing or any sort of analysis of the underlying biology of the kid. Now, to get back to the point about religious exemptions, which I previewed a minute ago. Okay, so there's like what I call the hard look approach and the say-so approach, okay? So the hard look approach, I just made these terms up. It's not like there's anything to them. Right? So the hard look approach, we have a hearing before some neutral party, usually a judge, right, to determine whether the belief is sincere and whether it's based on religion. Now, there were some cases, right, where the court looked at sort of whether the organized religion of which the person was a member had such a belief, right? But the better line of cases suggests, right, that you really can't do that because that creates establishment of religion problems, that you're favoring certain organized religions over others, and people can have, or I should say organized religions over, I guess, disorganized religions, right? That people can have religious beliefs without being a member of a church that recognizes those beliefs. But there were still cases where the court would do this hearing and say, even though we think, or even though we can't require your belief to come out of an organized religion, we just don't believe you. We think you're making this up for philosophical reasons. And in a state that doesn't have a philosophical objection, you lose. So there's a New York line of cases where people were members of the Universalist Life Church, I think was the name of it. And basically, there were a lot of chiropractors in this church, and you would pay like $5 or $10 to get in. And then one of the tenets of this church was that was opposition to being immunized, right? And there was this big argument, is this a real religion? Is this just a sham? And there was a lower court that said it's just a sham. But the appellate court said, even if it is a sham, say it is, there were tax issues with the church, even if it is a sham, we still have to independently ask whether this person's objection is based on a sincere religious belief. So even if their religion is a sham, their belief might not be a sham. Right? The problem with this is it's very labor intensive, right? So are you going to have a hearing over everybody who says this? And there's a further problem, which is the Supreme Court in the Hobby Lobby case, which I promise I will not get into, basically said that we really shouldn't be scrutinizing the sincerity of people's religious beliefs because that way lies madness, right? So if somebody expresses a religious belief, we assume it's sincere and we just go with it. So the hard look approach is sort of on the out. What's on the in is the say-so approach, which we follow in Delaware, which has been followed increasingly in a lot of states. And basically, you simply fill out a form and you attest to your religious objection. Okay, so here is the Delaware form, and I apologize. Is this going to be posted online after this or something? Because I know some of these slides are hard to read. So basically, we hereby swear or affirm, right? Which is odd because you think of affirmation when you don't have a belief in God, right? To a belief in a relation to a supreme being involving duties superior to those arising from any human relation. I'm not even done, all right? We further swear that our belief is sincere and meaningful. So that's it. It's sincere. Just ask me, all right? I'm telling you it's sincere. And occupies a place in my or our life parallel to that filled by the orthodox belief in God. This belief is not, it goes on to say, a political, sociological, or philosophical view of a merely personal moral code. I mean, if you want to make it easy for people, just give them a form. They don't even have to come up with this stuff, right? And they just have to sign it. This belief causes us to request an exemption from the mandatory school vaccination program. And as a practical matter these days, my guess is that in Delaware, it's just routine. So that's how it is in most states, yeah.
So what surprises me about this is the notion of religion here requiring belief in a supreme being, which not all religions do.
Well, it says, or it can be sincere and meaningful and occupy a place parallel to that filled by the Orthodox belief in God.
Parallel means it could be something else.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what that meant.
Yeah. There's a little bit of tension between those two statements, actually. They're not fully consistent with each other. But none of it really matters. Right? It could say, number 6, dinner is at 6:30. It doesn't matter you just have to sign it and you're done.
Yeah, it was written by lawyers, unintelligible to anybody else.
But that shouldn't be the case. Some other states have much clearer.
Yeah, I want out.
Yeah.
John, I read an interesting review of Dr. Offutt's recent book, and it criticized his knowledge of religion or of law. And it said that Dr. Offutt is ethnically defined by a religion, but he does not practice a religion. And that was a very astute comment, and it really was a tremendous slam dunk on him, and meant to put him down, I believe.
Yeah.
So it was a caustic article.
Yeah, I mean, sort of the question is, what's the basis of the belief? And really, it's complicated, right? So even if it's philosophical, it's not supposed to be, I think vaccines are dangerous. That's not a philosophical belief. If it's philosophical, it's supposed to be, I believe in the body and nature, and it comes to the same thing, right? It's just a question of how you word it. One of the reasons, I should say this, I don't like these religious exemptions, full stop, right? But in a way, I have to say, if I have to choose, the say-so approach makes more sense for this reason, right? What you find in the cases is the people that could hire good lawyers, that knew what to say in court, were the ones that were getting the exemptions, right? So I think like a lot of things in the law, if you can afford a lawyer, you can afford to go through a process, you're going to do better. So just from a social equality point of view, this makes more sense. But from my point of view, it's all bad. But anyway. So, should we retain these exemptions? Spoiler alert, no. Okay? So there are two ways to do away with them. Mississippi, quite surprisingly, in a 1979 decision by their state Supreme Court, held that the religious exemption in that state, which basically every state had at that point, was unconstitutional. Mississippi. And what they said was that this discriminates against the great majority of children whose parents have no such religious convictions. Right? Now, the court didn't look at things like herd immunity and whether there was really a risk. It wasn't sophisticated on that level. But what they were saying was, it really is sort of a riff on Jacobson in a way. Right? It basically says, these people that aren't vaccinating their children are putting other kids at risk against their will, and the court found it to be a violation of the constitutional guarantee of equal protection, that different people are being treated equally. Without getting too deeply into the thicket of constitutional law, that's a weird use of the Equal Protection Clause, is my technical analysis, right? That's not really how you see equal protection arguments deployed typically, right? But that's what the court did in the Mississippi case. Much more significantly, because everything that happens in California is hugely significant, right? Because something like, 1 out of 10 people in the country live there? I mean, it's enormous, like 40 million people or something. They repealed their religious exemption, and the repeal goes into effect on July 1 of next year. There are some grandfathering provisions, right? But essentially it goes into effect next July. And they repealed the following provision of the law. Immunization of a person shall not be required for admission to a school if the relevant person files with the governing authority a letter or affidavit stating that the immunization is contrary to his or her beliefs. Note it doesn't say religious beliefs, just any beliefs. That's gone. Okay? They just tried to get something on the ballot to to take that away, because you know the proposition process in California, right? They couldn't even get enough signatures to get it on the ballot. Okay, so at least for a while, this will be the law starting July 1 of 2016. Why? What happened in California? That's where we had the big measles outbreak in Disneyland. Of all the new ride, like the measles, I don't know. But it caused a huge outcry. It galvanized the vaccine required, well, I should say the public health community, right? And they got this law through. Yeah.
So does it apply to public and private school? And I'm not sure I understand the relationship with
Yes.
the repealing of this law and the application.
So in California, as a condition of going to, I think in California this is true, public school and private school, I'm not sure about homeschooling, but in those two contexts, you have to have all your immunizations in place as a condition of entrance.
But by the way, the homeschool parents are usually the population that don't vaccinate.
I know. And it's interesting how much of that, how much of their decision to homeschool is because they don't want to vaccinate, or how much it goes along with the philosophy of people that don't homeschool. It's sort of interesting to tease out the sort of the connections there. But yes, I bet there are data about the percentage of homeschoolers that don't vaccinate that would put them much higher in the general population. So that's what is happening that's what has already happened. Well, it's about to happen, but it's happened legislatively already in California, which shows it can be done. And I'm sort of wondering, Delaware, this is the only sort of political statement I'll make. One thing I've noticed about Delaware is because of the small size of the state and just the access that people have to legislators, which is really astonishing, by the way. It's not like California, right? I mean, you really have amazing access. For example, I had this idea about a law that the state should pass that recognizes certain kinds of relationships that aren't marriage, right? Between adults that want to protect certain rights between them. It could be like an elderly mom and her middle-aged son to do a lot of the stuff that otherwise you have to pay lawyers to do. Colorado has something like this. I met with a state senator in a Panera, and she was in sweats. I mean, you just can't do this in Pennsylvania even, right? So there's, really access, and things can happen through sort of personal connections. And, this may be something now that California has done this, and given what we know to be the effects of an unvaccinated population, that might sort of have some traction. Okay. So.
Oh, darn.
It's happening if you're getting feedback. You need to remind people again to mute.
Oh, people in space, can you, who are listening from a remote location, can you turn off your gizmos, because we're getting feedback here.
Just mute your device.
Mute your device. Thanks. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about STD vaccines, just a little bit. And here I'm going to talk mostly about HPV. My daughter's just turned 11 a few weeks ago. It's time for their HPV vaccine, right? That's the age at which the CDC recommends before kids, I don't even want to think about. I'll just say this is the age, all right? So even though the CDC recommends them for males and females, right? The only state that even has a law that sort of kind of halfway requires the vaccine is Virginia, which is maybe wouldn't be your first guess, right? And the law in Virginia says a complete series of 3 doses of HPV vaccine is required for females. Then they give the timetable, and then they say the parent or guardian may elect for the child not to receive the HPV vaccine. So the difference between this vaccine and other vaccines is you don't have to give a reason. You can just opt out, right? Just because you don't want your kids to have the vaccination. I think it's important to consider the different reasons why people would object to this particular vaccine, because the reasons are quite different than the reasons people object to the other vaccinations. And in this case, it really is because a lot of objectors, they may also object to vaccinations more generally, but they may say, I'm okay with the measles vaccine, rubella, all of those things, but I don't want my kid to be sexually active, and somehow, if they're not vaccinated, they'll be afraid of catching HPV. It's hard to even state this with a straight face, but this is sort of the argument, right? That I don't want to sort of do anything that will let my kid be sexually active without consequences, right? I mean, from any epidemiological, public health, any other point of view, but it doesn't come from those places, right? It comes from a belief about their own children and their sexual activity, and this kind of reminds them of it in a way. I think it's on a deep emotional level that you're dealing with. Most states do nothing, at least require nothing. Doctor will, what's that?
Surprise, surprise.
Yeah, doctors will talk, right, and say you should get the HPV vaccine. Why not? California, I discovered, allows girls who are 12 or older to get the vaccine without parental consent. This idea of the more mature minor that can make decisions about her own reproductive health, right? And this sort of goes along with that, at least philosophically.
The California law is specific to girls?
Yes. Yes.
The boys who are...
Yes. It could raise issues, right? Constitutional issues. Jim?
You just answered what I was going to.
Yeah, I was surprised to read that because somebody could challenge it. What about me? But obviously, the laws about reproductive rights applied to women, and so I think they're doing this analogously, but it doesn't seem to me that they should have done that. It seems to me they should apply it to boys as well. Particularly because of the messaging, right, about why boys should be vaccinated. But I just work here. I want to talk a little bit about informed consent to vaccination. And here, so I'm just curious, how many people here would sort of engage in this issue with patients about vaccinating their kids? Who's the one, two, just a couple, three? I just want to get a sense of sort of the conversation and talk a little bit about informed consent in the context of vaccination. So obviously, we're looking at a conversation that will talk about the benefits of vaccination to your child, right, and the risks of it, because we'll talk a little bit about the risks, which are pretty minimal, right? In a case like this, it might be appropriate to talk about risks to other kids. And so one of the questions, informed consent, usually talking about informing the patient about their own health, right? But there are sort of echoes in some cases that it might be appropriate as a piece of informed consent. And sometimes this is done in a negative way, like in the abortion context, right? But you can see in a case like this why you might want to have a conversation with patients about the risk not only to your kids but to the population, and then talk about the public health benefits of vaccination. So I'm wondering what kinds of conversations people have with their patients about this and whether you're getting resistance about childhood vaccination. We could leave the HPV out of it for now. We're just talking about the other vaccinations. Anybody have anything they like? Yeah.
I'll just tell you, I think that Pertussis ad that's on the television is very important, showing the big bad wolf. And I think that hits home. And I used that recently on my brother-in-law who doesn't believe in any vaccinations. I said, but your grandchildren, we want to bring it to them. And that completely changes mine, because you reframe it.
Oh.
And by reframing it, I think it really is powerful.
Have you? Yeah.
CDC does not require consent. The federal government does not require consent for vaccination.
The CDC does not require consent, but you can't. That's true, but you can't. I'm not sure if a CDC could do that legally.
Well, when you talk to them, they say it's only by state, because the form they put out has no place to sign a consent.
Well, I'm thinking of informed consent. So I think it's important when we talk about informed consent, not just to think about the form.
Well, you can inform them.
I'm thinking.
require a signature.
No. But
obviously, if they refuse, then you're not going to do it.
Right. No, so when I'm talking about informed consent, it's important to keep in mind, I'm not talking about a consent form. I'm talking about the legal concept of informed consent. So in a way, your question helps me to sort of clarify this for the group.
Talking about the process.
I'm talking about the process. Exactly. I'm talking about the process. Because forms are actually much less important. And in fact, forms can sort of go in the other direction by kind of taking the place of a real two-person or three-person conversation if both parents or guardians are in there, right? So there's this idea that we should be sharing with patients, sort of listening to their concern. I don't have the time to play this CDC video, which I thought was really pretty cheeseball anyway, but it has a doctor going to someone's house and meeting with three women and answering all these sort of staged questions. But I thought it might be interesting for doctors to sort of watch it and then maybe take something from it, anticipating some of the questions and concerns, things like autism, which cannot be, debunked even one more time without screaming, but they're still out there, right? So,
even though we try and educate patients with the facts, most of them have their mind made up before you talk to them. Shirley probably has the most experience talking to families, but it's very hard to sway their mind once they've read that and talked to them, even with the facts.
Well, one of the problems,
One other suggestion is that there was one very busy pediatric practice in the community that recently used to see patients who don't vaccinate their children, wrote an editorial in the News Journal, and I would suggest everybody look at the comments.
Well, comment, as a writer for Slate, and I've done some stuff for Politico lately, I've just stopped reading comments because according to them, I've been, I must die, right, basically. And no matter what the issue, it could be the most benign sort of thing, and what happens is people hijack the thread, and it ends up bearing no relation to what you actually wrote.
It is somewhat informative about what the public thinks.
Yeah, well, that's true. I mean, gun issues, for example, which I've written about, you propose the most modest thing, and basically it's always goes back to the Second Amendment and all of that, no matter what. Yeah.
John, as we discussed before, there's a recent article in this month's Law, Ethics, and Law, Medicine, and Ethics. It talks about the pro and the con. It has an article about the dismissal of patients. At what point do you dismiss them? And the next guy looks at why you can't dismiss them, and then they look at the ethical and the economic reasons. But they're very cogent articles. And they talk about what is your right to say, I cannot take care of you after all the efforts and all the time lapses and trying to make it and talking about it. But an interesting thing they did say in the last ethical thing is if you needed proof of immunization to go to an amusement park, maybe that would change the way people look at it as far as the coercion of doing it. But Tim, maybe for the Delaware Academy, if you give us the emails, we could send you the copies of those three articles because I think they're very important and very thorough.
Well, there's a couple of issues. One is sort of the bioethical issues, right? Or medical ethical issues, I should say. But the other issue I wonder about, and I wonder if there's data on this, is, to the extent that doctors won't see those patients, what then becomes of those patients, right? Do they then go out of the system? Do they stop giving their kids routine?
That's the downside risk. And how do you help them to get somebody else who will then take that, which is our duty. You just can't abandon them.
Right.
So it's really thoroughly looked at in these articles.
One of the problems, and the CDC video, there's a different video I watched that came on. You know how YouTube will just queue up the next video, and it can't be stopped unless you get off YouTube? Like you might get Adele 4 times in a row. But one of the problems is people will tell these heart-wrenching, and they're heart-wrenching, right? My kid took the MMR vaccine or all these vaccines at one day, and 6 hours later they started having seizures or whatever else. And it's the logical fallacy of post hoc ergo propter hoc, meaning the thing followed and therefore it was caused by it. And but if you're a parent in that position, it might be hard not to think that way. And these stories then go viral, and I think that just compounds the issue. Okay, so I want to just talk for. So I think we're doing the question and answer as we go along, right? So that people won't feel. Do you want to?
No, take your time.
Okay. So Sorry. So never give a law professor a podium. It's a huge mistake, and people will never learn. So I can talk a little bit about the Vaccine Injury Compensation Act and the program, and the so-called Vaccine Court, which is its kind of informal name. It's actually called the Federal Claims Court or something. So the way this works is, maybe I should go right to the table. There it is. And helpfully, for pedagogical reasons, it's so tiny you can't read it, but this is just an example from the vaccine injury table. Okay? So the way this works is there was a compromise that was achieved years ago, right, between pharmaceutical companies, okay, and basically lawyers. They got this through Congress. So here's what was happening. There were people that were injured, and you can think of a clear example would be if you took the live polio vaccine, right, which causes polio in 1 out of like 2 million people or something, but not no people, right? So what happens in those cases? Should the person be compensated? And there are other cases, obviously, where the causation is much less clear. And so people were losing the cases, right? But the pharmaceutical companies were worried because they were starting to maybe win some of them. So this compromise was reached. And this is the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. And the only sort of issue with it is by having a program like this, and suggesting aside from things like the polio vaccine, which, by the way, CDC, I think, now recommends only the inactivated polio vaccine because there's no, even though it's slightly less effective, there's no polio to worry about. So then the inactivated one makes more sense. So the way this works is, if you can see this table, which you can't, if a vaccine contains tetanus toxoid, and they list those vaccines, TAP, DTP, et cetera, and variations on a theme. If you have anaphylaxis or anaphylactic shock, brachial neuritis, I know what that is. Can some doctor tell me what that is? Brachial neuritis.
It's part of
Injury to brachial
brachial plexus inflammation.
Okay. Or anything that's a sequela of either of those things. Those are presumed to be caused by that vaccine. If it happens, the first one within 4 hours, the second one, the neuritis, within 2 to 28 days. The other one, there's no time period. If your injury is on the table, and for each vaccine, there are consequences that are listed that have been, I'm not saying we can say they're proven, but there's some suggestion. And mostly they're these ideas of anaphylaxis or anaphylactic shock. Sometimes it's encephalopathy. Encephalopathy, yeah, sometimes it's that. But those are the two most common, right? If your injury is on the table, there's a presumption that it was caused by the vaccination, and you have to first go to the vaccine court, right? And you recover your losses that are not compensated in different ways. So it's a secondary insurance program, right? Lost wages, hospital costs, to the extent those aren't covered, and then up to $250,000 in non-economic loss, pain and suffering. And if the person dies, it's also $250,000, essentially paid out of tax money. Not exactly, because it's an excise tax on the vaccine, but it's basically it really is sort of the same as tax money.
Is that a federal court?
Yes, it's a federal court. It's a federal court. If you lose or you don't like the result, you can go to a regular court. But hardly anyone does because this is such an effective mechanism. Okay. Now the reason I bring this up is because people could point to this and say, well, look, the fact that there's a program suggests that there are risks, and there are some risks. But again, the idea is to talk to people, explain how small the risk is compared to the benefit, and maybe get into sort of, discussions about larger public benefits. What about other? This is the last point I'll make. I'm sorry, this has probably gone longer than it should have. But so here are a couple of suggestions. And Dr. McNicholas and I were talking about what's actually called the stupid motorist law. Right. That doesn't get any any nastier than that. So basically, the idea is to get people to internalize the cost of their decisions, right? So the stupid motorist law says if you're, it doesn't only apply to motorists, but if you're trapped and you have to be rescued because of, and the public has to pay, you have to reimburse the public for your stupidity, basically. And so one suggestion that's been made is to tax the people who don't want to get vaccinated. Say, look, this imposes a cost, which we can cash out. There are different ways of doing that. But your decision has an economic consequence, and therefore, if you're not going to vaccinate your children, we are going to make you pay. And that the tax could be sliding depending on the burden of non-vaccination in the particular place and time. But that's one idea.
Yeah.
The other one, yeah, go ahead.
Susceptible to a very strong challenge for if my reason for not getting vaccinated is based on a religious belief in a state that recognizes imposing this tax on me poses a burden on me in relation of my freedom of religion.
Yes, that argument would be made. What I would say in response, first I would go, but then my more lawyerly response would be, in the Hobby Lobby case, which basically said we don't question sincerity, if a state needs a compelling interest, in the majority opinion itself, right, the court talks about something like the need to vaccinate the population as being a compelling interest. So it's right there in the decision as a compelling interest. It wasn't an issue in the case, which was about the right to contraception, or was it really an abortifacient, all that stuff.
Argument.
Right.
You can't compare Hobby Lobby to an individual. I mean, I understand.
No, I'm saying the court itself.
No, I understand. But
Said that the need to vaccinate can be considered, and so this would be, even from a religious point of view, would be a weaker argument, because you're not saying you can't. You're not saying you have to get vaccinated. What you're saying is you have to internalize the cost of that.
Yeah, no, but that's discrimination. That's discrimination, and a business making a choice for religious reasons and economics, not the same as an individual. Yeah, no, we'll see the case.
Yeah, we'll see the case. I actually think it's not that strong of a case, but given the Supreme Court, I don't know.
I'll bet you lunch.
It all depends on Justice Kennedy. And then finally, here's an idea, because no religious thing can overcome this, is the power of the tort law, and there have been some suggestions. One is to say that in certain times, in certain circumstances, with outbreaks, it might be negligent for a parent not to vaccinate their children. That's kind of a weak argument, actually. The stronger argument is to just impose a strict liability, and tort law can do that. For example, if I manufacture a product, even if I follow all safety protocols and the product is defective for some reason, I can sue somebody for my injuries even without a showing of fault. It's a strict liability principle. So calling this failure to vaccinate an abnormally dangerous activity, which imposes a risk, there's a whole body of tort law on this. I teach torts as well, right? You could make them accountable to the people who suffered the injury. It's different than a tax. Basically, my kid became infected because my immunocompromised kid, there was a lot of discussion about this. A kid that had cancer that couldn't get vaccinated, his parents had to keep him home from school because measles was happening, right? The argument would be if my kid catches measles, whatever the cost of that is, or dies because of an infectious disease, if you've caused that, if that's considered an abnormally dangerous activity, you pay.
Of course, no one would have enough money to pay that. So basically, it's just the threat to get people to vaccinate.
That's right.
Otherwise, you'd have all these people declaring bankruptcy.
Well, except their homeowners insurance, that's an interesting question. Their homeowners insurance might cover something like that because it usually covers you for negligence.
Yeah.
So that would raise interesting insurance questions, which we surely do not have time to get into. All right, so we just have a couple of minutes. I know people have things to do, but I'm happy to take a couple of questions.
How many people got this compensation, this $250,000 compensation?
I don't know. I don't know. I would be curious to find this out. How many cases are filed each year? The table is everything. If your injury is on the table, you're pretty much going to recover whatever cost you can prove, plus up to 250 G in uneconomic loss. If you're not on the table, you might as well just, I mean, you can, but you might as well just get it over with and get into a real court as fast as you can. But it's difficult to do, but you won't win there either. Yeah.
I was going to say, so we had a healthcare worker who got Guillain-Barré syndrome after a flu vaccine last year, 2 weeks after, and there was no other precipitating cause that was clear. So everyone told her about the court. And no, Guillain-Barré is not on the list, but it is one of those that it says something like will be dealt with on it, or will be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Yeah. And we encouraged her to apply because what's the harm?
There's been. I think last year there was a lot written about Guillain-Barré syndrome and whether it should be on the table.
She ended up filing it as workman's comp, which we ended up settling. So we don't mandate vaccine, but we come close.
Is she okay?
I mean, she's okay. She has some long-term.
Yeah, well, it does do that.
Yeah. So, but it was just hard, because we knew about this system, but we just trying to get her to apply and see if she could get anything additional out of it. We couldn't get her to do it.
Sometimes people just don't want to relive it, Yeah.
So this was a great talk.
Thanks.
At the end of the day, it's all about increasing suboptimal vaccination rates.
Yeah.
Which do you think is the path of least resistance to get there? Do you think it's having alternatives like these or widespread elimination of non-medical exemptions?
I would really think the most effective, I usually, because of how tort law works and because of public health and just the way my brain works, I usually think a multifaceted approach is best. But if I had to pick one, I would say by far the best thing we could do is get rid of these exemptions. I mean, it's just nuts to say that, and I can see why, not only the threat that Congress would take away the money, right, but the idea that when people were looking at a very well vaccinated population, right, you might say, well, a few people might take these religious exemptions, and when I ask students about this, they're very practical, right? They say, if it doesn't have a cost and we can protect people's religious liberty because of herd immunity and it's not going to be a problem, we should do it. But I think the time has come when the by now long-term success of all of these vaccinations has just caused people to think, well, why should I, from an individual point of view, it's perfectly rational. Why should I vaccinate my child? And because the religious exemptions are almost as a matter of constitutional law these days, so easy to get, it seems to me our best bet is just to eliminate them. I mean, I was surprised at how little pushback there was in California. They couldn't even get on the ballot. It's like 40 million people living in California. You only need like 250,000 signatures. They couldn't even get them.
Yes, but are you suggesting it's time for federal? Or because each state, don't let the prices go unused. So any state that has an outbreak is ripe for this type of move.
I would favor a federal solution, but I would also favor Santa Claus. I mean, I just don't, and I think I just don't think that's in the cards at all.
You don't think a federal law?
No.
Does federal law even have, I don't know what the correct way to phrase the question, but jurisdiction to the individual states for health law?
Well, again, if it affects interstate commerce,
so
you could make the argument.
Yeah, 10 years ago the answer is yes. Today it's a little more.
Today it's maybe. They were barely able to save Obamacare. And actually, it failed on the Commerce Clause. Yeah. It was saved by Justice Roberts calling it a tax because the idea of an individual mandate, something you have to do, doesn't affect commerce. It could be challenged. I'll just say that. Yes.
So, I mean, you didn't even get into the whole issue of mandating healthcare worker vaccination.
I did not.
So we do allow people to decline here, but we ask them to tell us why they're declining. And over the last few years, we've had another option, and that's the one that's by far most.
Do they have to explain or just check a
Well,
box?
they're supposed to explain, but they don't always. So we took that out this year. So they don't have that option.
So what's on the? So what are the options?
Things like I never get the flu. I get sick from the flu shot. I get the flu. I mean, all the myths that are out there. I'm pregnant, even though it's
Oh,
not.
you're just doing it for informational purposes.
Yeah, for those that are, and then we can target education against that.
Yeah.
So, but it's interesting. We're not done for this year yet, but we have close to 200 responses. And
what's your rate of refusal?
So we usually end up with about 400 per year, which out of 11,000 employees, so it's not that bad, but 2% or so. But we this year so far, since we took away the other, the far most common one is I just don't want it. So it's just kind of, and like I don't know how to target education against that.
Maybe take that out and see what their second choice is.
Yeah, they can choose more than one.
Oh, okay.
So we haven't gotten to the depth of analyzing that yet.
Quick one. I was just wondering what the law says about parents denying cover or treatment to their kids for other things like a blood transfusion or chemotherapy, etc. Because it's not really their own religious freedom. It's religious freedom to inflict on your children that affects their health. Slightly different issue.
Mute your devices, please. Thanks. Here's what the law says. Okay, there's this triangle: state, the parent, and the child. Right? We usually let the parent decide what's best for the child. Major exception, right? If the parent's decision is going to seriously affect the child's health or kill the child, we overrule the parent. There are interesting cases on this at the intersection of kind of word battery, bioethics, public health, where essentially a doctor will say this kid needs chemotherapy, and the parent will say no. Usually, in those cases, the parent will be upheld because sometimes the course of treatment can be long, it's uncertain. So you also have to look at the certainty of or the upside. So a blood transfusion is the clearest case, right? The kid will die without a blood transfusion. Give the kid a blood transfusion, parents, even if your religion counsels otherwise, right? Things like longer courses of treatment for cancer, it might depend what state you're in and what court you get. But the more intrusive, exhaustive, and the less certain the positive outcome, the less likely the state is to require the parent to do that for their kid. There's a further complication, which is when the kid reaches a certain age, and we see this in custody decisions, we see this in family law as well, when the kid reaches adolescence and their voice starts to rise and the parent starts to fall a little bit. So I wish I could give you something more quantitative than that, but that's kind of where the law is.
I'm a pediatric anesthesiologist, and I've had numerous cases where Jehovah's Witness families, and I have a child that's going to bleed out, a major case, and we override it and give the blood anyway. We do our best to try to hold it back on it, though, but we will give blood without hesitation if the baby needs it.
Yeah, go ahead, I'm sorry.
In the state of Maryland, you didn't need one. You didn't need a court order to do it.
You do need a court order.
In the state of Maryland, we did not.
Okay.
Emergency provision.
Yeah.
Better come fast.
You know? It's not like you're going to play on the phone in the operating room. But I was going to say the issue of pregnancy has always been perplexing, and that is the Jehovah's Witness parturian that is underage. So you have defined as, I'll just make up something, 14 years old, 16 years old. Now that person's pregnant, but is at risk of hemorrhaging during the pregnancy. And then the question is, and the patient has some cognitive ability to say, I'm a Jehovah's Witness person, but on one hand, and please correct me if I'm wrong.
I know what you're
because I don't know, we always have to call risk management and have them walk us through this. But the issue is, first, is this patient competent to make that religious statement or age appropriate? Are they emancipated minor, or, you know, what is this person now that they're with child making this decision? One of the things we've been told is that because they're not chronologically an adult, they're not capable of saying, in other words, I'm Catholic, we go through a confirmation process before we become.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
I'm going. And so Jehovah's Witness, there's a process that you actually declare, I'm in, when you're a certain age. So just, I may not have explained this well, I'm not a lawyer, but that's the tension that arises in the pregnancy case.
Well, and it's further complicated by the fact that there's a fetus. Right. So even though legally the woman can't be treated as a vessel, but as a practical matter, healthcare providers and courts will do more backflips to try to override her decision if they think it'll be detrimental to the fetus. Maybe, Sarah, do you want to?
We have an online viewer from the Department of Public Health.
Okay.
It's saying, having audio issues, but it's saying that private schools in Delaware are required to ensure their students are immunized. And the recognized medical exemptions are now listed. Anything not on the list has to be reviewed and approved by the Department of Public Health.
Okay. So about the medical exemption, I totally believe that because there can be there can be regulatory supplementation of that. If the unless the statute is effectively modified by regulations, I don't see why private school would have to do this. My guess is that the private schools are requiring it.
It sounds like it's
Tower Hill does.
Delaware Administrative Code 4.2.
Okay, so administrative code basically suggests that it's a regulatory thing, and that raises the important issue for me about whether this only law geek could care about this, is whether the administrative regulation can basically contradict what the statute seems to say. I mean, regulation is supposed to implement and flesh out statutes and not contradict them. So somebody might challenge that at some point, at least as far as the statute's concerned.
The universities are requiring it also.
Yes.
As a parent, I've had to deal with all of that.
Well, and our students, even at the law school, are like, "Oh, I have to get this vaccine." You know, I said, "Well, do it. This is public. I'm teaching public health law. Go do it."
So I was a resident in Philadelphia in 1991 during the measles. There was a measles epidemic.
I remember that.
There were a number of children in a church group that were unvaccinated that died in that church group. So the city of Philadelphia did decide to jump, and they also didn't believe in any Western medicine or medicine care in this church group. So the city of Philadelphia did decide to intervene those kids, and a number of us as residents were deputized to go out we went to each of us about 6 houses and had a court order to hospitalize any kids who we thought were sick and at risk of dying within this church group.
I mean, millions of people
intervened in that. We didn't have to, by the way. We didn't have to hospitalize any of the children.
But
we had the authority.
Yes. The city, I think what the city as opposed to the state, just announced a change in their process now.
Right.
So if to get your child into school when it starts, if there is absence of one of the required vaccinations, instead of getting a year to do it, you've got 5 days. The child will not be allowed in school after 5 days without it, which is a great implementation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do we have any idea of what's the proportion of people who refuse vaccination in the U.S. or in Delaware?
I'll say this. I don't. Somebody probably does, but it tends to happen in clusters. Is the problem, right? So there's Vashon Island near Seattle, right, which has a lot of back to nature people. There's a very high rate of vaccine refusal there, right? It tends to be clustered in certain groups, and one group is sort of well-educated, back to nature. There's a high, I think, correlation between that and people who believe we're living in a toxic environment, and there are food allergy issues that go along with it. So it might be useful, I think, to look at particular populations when you're trying to consider, this is sort of public health 101, trying to think about what interventions to do, sort of figure out what the resistance is in the particular population you're dealing with. And I think when you're dealing with well-educated people, you might think it would be easier but sometimes it's like they can just do more mental backflips to sort of keep doing what they're doing. So, well, I think it's taken longer than expected, but I think I'm losing the audience. So thank you so much for coming.